Hello class, in today's video we're going to talk about Aristotle's rhetoric and his discussion of the three modes or elements of persuasion: logos, ethos, and pathos. So Aristotle's rhetoric, right, the book known as the Rhetoric, is sometimes associated with his works on ethics and political philosophy, and sometimes associated with his works on logic. Since we're reading the text in a logic class, you could say that I've already decided to associate the Rhetoric with Aristotle's Organon, right, his collection of logical treatises. Now, why do I do that? I do it because I think that the Organon is overall concerned with a discussion of how human beings come to form beliefs about things, how they can check the accuracy of those beliefs, the validity of the arguments leading up to those beliefs, and so on and so forth. And I think that Aristotle's Rhetoric contributes to that discussion, contributes to that project. That is what scholars would call the Greco-Arabic interpretation of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Why do they call it the Greco-Arabic interpretation? Because in early Greek editions of Aristotle's complete works, or early Greek editions of Aristotle's logical works, the Rhetoric was included in the Organon. Similarly, in the early Arabic translations of Aristotle's work, the Rhetoric was also associated with the Organon. The other tradition, the tradition that associates it with political and moral philosophy, is what I would call the Latin tradition. The Latin tradition traces itself back to a 13th century philosopher named Giles of Rome, who translated the Rhetoric from Greek into Latin, but when he did so, it was attached to a translation of Aristotle's Politics. And so in the Latin tradition, Aristotle's Rhetoric is often interpreted as a contribution to political philosophy as opposed to a contribution to logic and critical thinking. And there are good reasons for both of those decisions, right? There are good arguments in favor of the Greco-Arabic placement of the Rhetoric, and there are good arguments for the Latin placement of the Rhetoric. Giles of Rome's decision to associate the Rhetoric with the Politics and the Ethics is followed by translators and editors of Aristotle working in most modern Western languages. So if you were to look at a collection of Aristotle's works that had been translated into, say, like German or French or Spanish or English, they would be following the Latin tradition. So in this class, I'm following the Greco-Arabic tradition because I think it is, in a sense, more interesting. Why is that? Because on the Greco-Arabic reading of the Rhetoric, there's a hierarchy of belief formation mechanisms, one could say. The highest, the best way of forming one's beliefs is through logical analysis, through philosophy, like in the fullest sense of the word, in terms of metaphysics and deep scientific understanding of the nature of reality, and then combined with a careful syllogistic analysis of the arguments for the position you're going to take. But not everyone can do that. Not everyone has the time, not everyone has the inclination. Not every topic gives itself to be understood in that way. So on the Greco-Arabic reading, particularly the one advanced by the philosopher Averroes, Rhetoric steps in as a less precise, less elevated, less noble form of persuasion, or less noble form of belief production, but which is more flexible and more adaptable and can be more widely used. Now, Averroes thinks that the conclusions argued for by the philosopher via philosophical logic, and the conclusions argued for by the rhetorician via the tools of rhetoric need not be different conclusions. They could be two ways of getting you to believe the same thing. The philosopher uses philosophical arguments to get you to believe X, Y, or Z. The rhetorician uses rhetoric to try to get you to believe X, Y, and Z. The difference is going to be in how they get you there and the degree to which your belief in X, Y, and Z is complemented by an understanding of why X, Y, and Z is the case and what justifies those claims. To make matters more interesting, in the Greco-Arabic tradition, there's a third book that is seen as a tool of persuasion, or as part of the study of persuasion. And this is Aristotle's book on poetry, called the Poetics. And when Aristotle talks about poetry, he doesn't just mean like sonnets and lyrical poetries. He basically means storytelling. And that storytelling, Aristotle is going to maintain, at least on the Greco-Arabic reading, is also a form of persuasion. It is a form of persuasion that is in a way the most widely applicable, the most flexible, the most widely used, but also the least informative. But, to go back to Averroes, just as the philosopher and the rhetorician could persuade you to believe X, Y, and Z through their respective methods, so too could the poet. Right? So the poet might also get you to believe X, Y, and Z, but with radically different methods. So how does this look? Let's say the proposition I want you to believe is that you should be a vegetarian. So if I'm a philosopher and I'm trying to explain to you why you should be a vegetarian, I am going to develop this metaphysical argument about the intrinsic dignity of animals and why eating meat is an offense to the dignity of the animals, and that therefore it is morally wrong, and sort of develop this whole philosophical defense of vegetarianism. If I'm a rhetorician, if I'm doing it rhetorically, I'm not going to get into all the details of the metaphysics of animal life and sort of the philosophical minutiae. I am going to appeal to what Aristotle calls logos, ethos, and pathos, and I'll come back to that more. Right? But I'm going to try to persuade you not to eat meat, but again, without all the justifications and the details and the rigor of a philosophical argument. And then finally, the poet, if they want you to become a vegetarian, is maybe going to tell a story about a talking animal that feels bad when his friend is eaten. Right? There's no deep story, there's no deep argument or anything like that. It's just a story that maybe puts you in a certain mood and gets you to look at things a certain way. And so, put that aside for a second to focus just on rhetoric. Right? So how does rhetoric work? Well, Aristotle says that when it comes to persuasion, there are three elements: logos, ethos, and pathos. Rhetoric partakes of all three of them. And one could say that philosophy, ideally, partakes only of logos. So, what is logos? Well, logos as a Greek word is very varied. It has a lot of different possible translations. It can mean word, it can mean sentence, it can mean theory. So if you take a class like biology, that's the logos of bios. And bios is the Greek word for life. Or if you take a class like psychology, that's the ology part is the logos of psyche, which is the Greek word for soul or mind. Right? So a logos is basically an account of something, an explanation, a theory. Philosophy should proceed almost entirely at the level of pure logos, if possible. Rhetoric will use a little bit of logos. When the rhetorician is giving a speech, they're not telling a story with talking animals or anything. They are trying to make sense. They are trying to develop a theory, but they are not trying to develop it with scientific, philosophical rigor. They're trying to just give you the general idea. All right, so that's the first element in rhetoric, is logos. But it's not 100% full-on logos. It's kind of a watered-down logos because it's mixed in with these other things, ethos and pathos. So what are those? Well, ethos is where we get our word ethics from, and it means something like character. And one of the things that Aristotle emphasizes is that in rhetorical situations, one's view of the character of the speaker matters in a way that it doesn't, or at least ought not to, in philosophy. Right? So there are some philosophers that I think are very, very smart, but I also think that they are terrible, terrible human beings, and I would not be their friend, right? So you can Google around. There's a guy named Martin Heidegger, who's one of the most influential philosophers in the 20th century, but also just a complete dirtbag. But in a sense, that's okay, because in philosophy, we're only concerned with the logos. But in rhetoric, because the logos is not, at 100%, because it's mixed with these other things matter, which brings us back to character, to ethos. Right? Aristotle will say that in a rhetorical context, there are some people that no one is going to believe, even if they're speaking the truth. Right? You can think of the boy who cried wolf. Right? In the story of the boy who cried wolf, there is a shepherd kid who, whenever he goes out to watch the sheep and gets bored, he says that there's a wolf, so everyone comes running and he thinks it's funny. And so people begin to say, hey, this kid's full of crap. We can't believe a word that he says. Right? Whenever he says that there's a wolf, it's because he's a stupid practical joker and he's wasting all our time. So that's what they think of him. And so what happens when there really is a wolf, right? He cries wolf, but nobody comes. But why don't they come? Because they think he's a jackass. So it's ethos, right? He is telling the truth. And he could even give an argument like, hey, I see a wolf. The wolf is walking towards me. The wolf is eating sheep. Therefore, it's an emergency. But even though he has that argument, and even though there's evidence for that argument in view like the wolf pack surrounding the sheep, nobody's going to believe him because they think he's a jerk. So that's the role that ethos plays in persuasion. That even when you're telling the truth, if people don't think that you're trustworthy, if people don't think that you are the kind of person who would know those things and who could be relied upon to state those things accurately, then no one's going to be persuaded. And then finally, the third element is pathos. The easiest way to translate it is as passion. And when you think of someone that's passionate, you think of someone that's very emotional, right? Where the emotions are running at the surface. When Aristotle talks about pathos, he's talking about the role that your emotional state, your mood, plays in your formation of beliefs. Now, we like to think, or at least a lot of people like to think, that I form my beliefs totally objectively. I am like a pure rational calculator. But generally speaking, Aristotle's going to say that, especially in rhetorical contexts, that's not true. If I'm angry at someone, I'm more likely to believe bad things about them. Or if I am in love with someone and someone starts telling me bad things about the person that I love, I'm going to be inclined to disbelieve them. Why? Because my emotional state, my pathos, influences how I form beliefs. And so one of the things that Aristotle will talk about in the rhetoric is how an effective speaker can create certain moods in their audience and therefore predispose them to believe certain things without evidence. Right? So if I want you to believe that my neighbor goes out every night and turns over the soccer goals in the park and like cuts holes in the nets. One way I might do that is by getting you ticked off at my neighbor. Because once you're ticked off at my neighbor, once you're angry at my neighbor, you're more likely to believe bad things about her. Right? Well, on the other hand, if you have positive feelings for someone, then you're less likely to believe bad things about them and more likely to believe good things about them. But this isn't just about people, Aristotle would say. If you're just in a bad mood, sometimes you have those days where you're just like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. You're just like, oh, everything's awful. Nothing matters. You're just like that. Then it's very easy for someone to come by and persuade you of other bad things. So in belief formation, as much as we like to think that it's just logos, in reality, ethos and pathos also come into play. Now, let me bring this back to Averroes in the Greco-Arabic reading. Right? So Averroes would say, and I think he says this rightly, that philosophical persuasion, pure logos, is a very rare thing, and that most people don't have the time, training, or inclination for those kinds of discussions. And I'm including myself here. Like, yes, I am a philosophy professor, but if someone said, hey, I want to read this 75-page scientific paper about something, I just be like, I don't want to, unless it's my job. Otherwise, I don't want to. So, pure philosophical explanation is very rare and of limited use when you're dealing with large groups of people. Right? This is why when people are running for office, they don't give detailed philosophical, scientific speeches, right? They go for the rhetoric. And so the rhetoric is what sort of grabs the biggest group of people and brings them in and persuades them of things. And then poetry, storytelling, is the form of persuasion that gets sort of everyone that rhetoric misses. That's how you persuade kids of things. So logos, ethos, and pathos. Ideally, philosophy, pure logical analysis, but also something like mathematics and those sorts of things would be almost like pure logos. Rhetoric is a mixture of logos, ethos, and pathos. Storytelling is very light on the logos. Right? Storytelling, poetics, is very light on the logos and heavy on the ethos and the pathos, putting you in a certain mood to feel certain ways. These are elements of belief formation that go beyond sort of the purely philosophical.